Welcome to Berries in the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries and so much more. Let's dive in.
Welcome, everybody, back to In the Interim. I'm your host, Scott Berry. And today I have a guest with me, and my guest is Dr. Lindsay Berry. Lindsay, welcome to In the Interim.
Hi, thank you. I'm excited to be here. I did not know I was going to be on a podcast when I woke up this morning, but it's the crazy life of a statistician.
Yes, it's at any time you could be called into an interim analysis. And it's particularly problematic when the host of In the Interim is your father, and he can get a hold of you really at any particular time. So thanks for joining on the spur of the moment, and we'll get to why within this. First, you've been on, I think this is your third interim analysis, third
Yep.
In the Interim. And but let's introduce to everybody who I know everybody out there watches every episode at least once and probably know who you are. But you tell us a little bit about how you got to In the Interim. You went to undergraduate at the University of Texas, and how did you end up here?
Yeah, let's see. So I did my undergraduate in math at UT Austin. I liked math. I liked statistics. I did a couple of summers interning at Berry Consultants, just learning, what do they do here? All kinds of things. I, got advice from some Berry Consultants on graduate school. That was kind of what I was thinking of doing next. I talked to a couple statisticians here. Melanie Quintana was one. She had gone to Duke and really enjoyed her time at the Duke PhD department. And so that's where I ended up studying and getting my PhD in statistical science. So while I was there, I learned a lot of, focus in Bayesian statistics. Not much clinical trial design. I did my dissertation in Bayesian dynamic modeling and prediction for time series, and specifically time series for count data. So this was kind of, the application was building models to predict the daily sales of supermarket items was kind of our core application. And so you can imagine there's kind of elements of different scales of modeling where maybe the daily sales of a product are small counts where you might sell a couple of boxes of spaghetti each day. But then you have higher level scales where you might aggregate across stores and have regional sales. You might aggregate over time and have models on those scales. So this was kind of working on, can we leverage some of that hierarchical information? So can using information about pasta as a class of items and what we know about predictions of pasta at that level, can that better inform our predictions of, Barilla spaghetti on Tuesday next week? So that was what my focus was on in graduate school. And when it came time to leave, I was not sure exactly what I wanted to do. And I talked to Scott, and he has a very convincing way of selling what we do here at Berry Consultants. And so I was kind of sold on the idea that Bayesian statistics can make a big difference in clinical trials. And it's, this is a way where what we do has impact. And I think it really matters to the patients at the end of the day. And it's also just, I get to do all the things I like to do, which is, a little bit of coding. I get to learn about new disease areas. I get to write, I get to read papers, I get to collaborate with people, clinicians, lots of different people. So it all worked out really well. And I'm now working here at Berry Consultants, and I've been here coming up on 7 years. I'm loving it.
And to back up a little bit, there's kind of an interesting side story to this. So your grandfather, Don Berry, he had on his dissertation committee, sort of a co-advisor, was Jay Cadane at Yale with Jimmy Savage. And by the way, if you haven't seen the podcast where he talks about Jimmy Savage, you need to go listen to that. It's fantastic. And then I went to Carnegie Mellon, where Jay Cadane was, and he was my advisor. And I've not heard of other stories where a parent and child both had the same advisor. And your last choice of graduate schools was Carnegie Mellon and Duke. And you could have gone to Carnegie Mellon and been a third generation Jay Cadane. He said he would. He's emeritus, but he would have happily been there. But you went to Duke, and Mike West was your advisor, and so an interesting story. Okay, now what are we talking about today? I'm going to introduce how we got here, and I posed a problem to a number of statisticians here at Berry, and Lindsay was one of them, and she helped solve it. And so we'll talk about what the problem is. And what the solution is. And so I want to try to set it up a little bit. So years ago, this is analyzing ordinal endpoints. And years ago, we were involved in the design of a stroke trial. And the trial was the DAWN trial, DAWN. And it was an adaptive design with potential enrichment. And we were going to enrich off certain patients depending on the size of their stroke and the clinical mismatch if the device, which was endovascular therapy, wasn't beneficial to them. And so the adaptive design was going to analyze them, and it might narrow in on a position where the endovascular therapy was beneficial. This is at a time where endovascular therapy, which, by the way, now is an incredible therapy, saves many, many lives, saves much morbidity. At the time, it was controversial. It was unclear. There was actually non-proportional effects. It was increasing mortality, but increasing the number of good outcomes as well. It was quite controversial. And so we were really worried that we would enroll patients where it wasn't beneficial. But understanding it's not beneficial across an ordinal outcome is a little bit challenging. Are you only looking for elevated bad outcomes, less good, was particularly challenging. So I'll set this up, and many of you may know the endpoint. The standard endpoint in stroke trials is the Modified Rankin Score. And I think it's universally used in acute stroke trials. It's used in a number of other trials as well. It's an outcome that has 7 possible states. Everybody recognizes the ordinality of this, and the 7 states are very much considered clinically different states. The best outcome is a 0. So the Modified Rankin Score of 0, essentially you have no symptoms. And so Lindsay is a 0. I'm a 0 as well, but within this, so we are zeros. We have no neurological symptoms, relatively healthy. And then it goes from 1, 2, 3, all the way down to 6. So 1, for example, is no significant disability. You're still independent, but you have some symptoms, neurological symptoms. You may have weakness in the arms. You may have a little bit of difficulty walking, but you're largely no significant disability. 2, you have slight disability. You still care for yourselves. You're able to brush your teeth. You're able to ambulate. You are still independent. Then 3 is moderate disability. You have some need for walk assistance. You need some assistance from care. You can't necessarily care for yourself. 4 is moderately severe. It's referred to. unable to walk alone, unable to really care for yourself, but you're out of a hospital. You do have some cognitive function within that. And then 5 is nearly a vegetative state. You're hospitalized, you're in a bed, we'll call it a vegetative state, and then 6 is dead within that. So those are the 7 outcomes, and it's a validated outcome. We can measure that. And this is the outcome we look at in a stroke trial at 90 days. So the question is how to analyze that and how to understand the device versus a control and whether we should enrich. Proportional odds doesn't really work because it's funky in how it does that. We might be increasing deaths within that. So we had to create a weighting of the ordinal scales in order to make that decision. So we worked, and I'll come back to this. So we created what we called a utility-weighted MRS, where we created a numerical ranking of those 7 states. And I'll describe more about it. I think it's important to describe that. But very simply, for example, if you're a 0, that's the highest score you can have. You're a 1. That's the highest neurological status. If you're dead or actually vegetative, they're both 0s. And then the values between those are numerically. So a 1 is 0.91. It's not as good as a 0, and then it's 0.76 for a 2, and then it's 0.65, and then it drops to 0.33 at 4, and then it drops to 0. So that's the numerical weighting, and we'll talk about how we got there. The Dawn trial ran, and it actually turned out to be an incredible success. The trial never enriched. It was beneficial for all the patients enrolled. It launched endovascular therapy through 24 hours. These were patients that had later strokes. And it was significant on any way you analyze the endpoint. It was significant. You probably could have dichotomized it at any point and the trial would have been significant. But it was certainly significant on the utility weighted. Okay. Now, we got criticism for the scale. And it's a really now it's one of these things. I think it's much more interesting to me whenever you have this and all of a sudden you're criticized in the academic literature for the approach. It's kind of exciting within this. So the investigators, European investigators, which led a trial called the Mr. Clean trial, which also was highly successful, demonstrating benefit of endovascular therapy. And this came out in stroke, and it was pushback on the utility-weighted scale. The lead author is Deichland and the Mr. Clean investigators. Now, I'll get to the criticisms they had of the utility weighted, but did I set the problem up, Lindsay?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for people who are thinking about the utilities for the first time, it's sort of the 0 and 1 are kind of arbitrary, right? It's just sort of the best is a 1, the worst is a 0, and then it's the intervening values and the distances between them that are kind of the important element there. And then maybe, I don't know if you want to mention sort of the alternative analysis or the way most people might analyze the MRS.
Well, I will, and that was part of the criticism. They said you shouldn't do this utility weighted, you should do it a different way within that. But you're right, and we'll get back to this, that the difference between an MRS 0 and an MRS 1 is 0.09. That's the important part. It goes from 1 to 0.91. Then from 1 to 2, it drops 0.15. That clinically, according to that scale, that's a bigger drop than 0 to 1, from 1 to 2. And then 2 to 3 drops again another 0.11. And then it drops 0.32. So from at that point, from a 3 to a 4 is 0.32, and a 4 to a 5 is 0.33. Those are the big drops in the clinical states. And so the relative weighting matters in how you analyze it. Okay, so the criticism of them and their alternative way is they say you shouldn't do this. You should do a proportional odds model. So a proportional odds model assumes that for each dichotomous shift, like you want to get 0, that's a good outcome. There's some odds of 0 for the treatment relative to control. And then there's some odds of being 0 or 1. Then there's some odds of being 0, 1, or 2, and so on. All of these shifts, and it models that with a constant odds. Proportional odds. This is also in the literature called a shift analysis in the stroke literature. And they said you should just do proportional odds. Now, it's sort of irrelevant for this. They argue about that it's higher powered, and we actually pointed out that they were wrong on that. But that's less important to this. The biggest, when we pointed out that it wasn't more highly powered, they came back and gave several criticisms of the utility-weighted approach we had. And the biggest ones were that they complain about the statistical assumptions of it, which I think is just completely wrong. When you analyze using the utility weight, it's essentially a t-test on the utility values that come out. Each of the values has a weight, and this is a finite set of values 0 to 1. The central limit theorem kicks in at 5 patients, probably 10 patients. So there are no assumptions to this analysis other than the weights. So there's no proportionality assumption to the utility weighted. Their biggest criticism was that not everybody has that utility function. So you're going into a trial and you're assuming that that utility function that I just described, the 0.91, 0.76, was not everybody has that. And that was a huge criticism that they have.
Do you think that comment, is it not everyone as in patients will have different utilities? Or is it sort of clinicians when they're interpreting the result, or both?
I think it's both, but their comments were more about patients. Not every patient has those. And interestingly, in Mr. Clean, they did a question where they asked them their relative utilities of them. It's not uncommon that they do this EQ5D, quality of life, and they ask them the scales. Turns out the values they got were very, very similar to what we used. The interesting thing, though, is they pointed out there's a standard deviation. Not everybody says a 1 is 0.91. Theirs was 0.95, by the way, relative to a 1, and then it was 0.87, 0.65, really very similar to what we got. But the point was they're not all the same. So you should do a proportional odds model. They even say, when they pointed out the assumptions, that even if proportional odds is violated, the result is still a good test. And so they push back heavily against our use of these utility weights. By the way, this is a common criticism that a lot of people have of this approach, is that not everybody shares that utility. Okay, so this bothered me. It bothered me that a statistical algorithm was kind of, the proportional odds assumption was the analysis, and it was avoiding the question of what is the relative weight of the scale. So I posed to Berry, I think the proportional odds is weighting those values, but I don't know what they are. So I posed that problem, and what happened, Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, And going back to your previous point, talking about sort of even if the proportional odds assumption is violated, if you fit the proportional odds model and you get this estimated proportional odds ratio effect, it still can be interpretable in that scenario. And I think most people interpret it as some kind of average or weighted average of the odds ratios that you would get if you looked at each dichotomization of an ordinal scale. So the 0 versus the 1 to 6, the 0 to 1 versus 2 to 6, and so on. So it's some kind of weighted average of those separate odds ratios, and the weight is really based on the prevalences or the number of patients that fall within each of the categories 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so Scott posed this question, and I think, he kind of intuited the answer that, it has to be based on the prevalences in some way. And so that was a big hint of sort of where a place to start. But we went back and we read some papers by John Whitehead back in the 1900s.
Careful now, careful.
I think from my birth year. And so in this paper, Whitehead presents some formulas for sample size calculations using the proportional odds model. And so there's really nice formulas there for, calculating sample size for the distribution of the score test statistic from a proportional odds model, where you have the treatment arm as in a covariate in the model. So really nice formulas there. And that was where we started. We took those formulas and, I don't want to go through the math, but really it was just a matter of algebra, rewriting those, the score test statistic and the variance of that test statistic, rearranging the terms, and the weights kind of just fall out of it. You can show that the proportional odds score test statistic, that test can be written so it's equivalent to a test of a mean difference in a specific set of weights that are given to the categories of the ordinal outcome. And those weights are defined based on the number of patients that fall into each of the ordinal categories. So essentially the weights are defined based on the prevalences. So I'll stop there and see if I answered your question.
Yeah. So restate the punchline of this is you were able to show the equivalence of a proportional odds model is you can write it as an analysis of weights of each of those, as though I were to write down those weights and say, rather than our utilities that we started with, we could write down the weights that it's mathematically the same as that. So a proportional odds model imposes weights on each of them that you can write down, and they're a function of the prevalence. So the difference between a 0 and 1 depends on how many zeros and ones there are. You think more about that depending on how many there are compared to the difference between a 3 and a 4 or a 4 and a 5. So let's give people a couple of these. Suppose you were to see very equal weights of very equal prevalence of the 6 states.
Yeah.
What weight do you give to each of those?
Yeah, then the weights, it's sort of you can imagine the weights as a line. So the distance in between each category is about the same. So the distance between a 0 and a 1 or a 5 or a 6 is about the same.
Yep.
So it'd be about a sixth of the scale.
We could go in and say, we're going to weight these equal. So a difference from a 3 and a 4 MRS or a 0 and a 1 is equivalent. They're all 1. That would be the weights imposed if you have equal prevalence. If you have more negative outcomes, you weigh more the difference on that side of the scale. So a difference from a 6 to a 5 and 6 are combined in this. Difference between 5 and 4 is bigger than 0 and 1 because of the prevalence within that. The utility you impose by doing proportional odds. So the title of this has the fallacy of ordinal outcomes. When they say the beauty of the proportional odds is that all you have to assume is they're ordinal. So a 0 is better than a 1, and a 1 is better than a 2, and a 2 is better than a 3. That's all you're assuming, they say. That's not true. It's a fallacy, and you are imposing weights, and you could absolutely calculate exactly the weights you've imposed, and we'll come back to that on some other endpoints, and you could do the analysis that way. And by the way, you get rid of any assumption about proportional odds. So in some ways, we're sympathetic to their point that you don't really care about proportional odds. But what they're doing is they're creating the weights. We brought utilities to the table. They're creating them through prevalence. Now, their biggest criticism of us was that not everybody in the population agrees with your weights. You're doing bad stuff, team, because there's variability in that thought. The proportional odds does exactly the same thing, just they don't even tell you what they are, what the weights are, but they're imposing that everybody has the same utility. But the difference is theirs is created by prevalence. There may be an objective comfort with that. It really bothers me that a statistical assumption describes the clinical utility of different outcomes as opposed to clinical utilities. Okay. Now, I'm not hiding where I stand on this point, sort of thing. Relative.
I feel like we're being a little harsh on the proportional odds model, which I think you would say you do use in some cases, and we think it's a good model in a lot of cases. But the objection is really this people putting it forward as though it doesn't make any assumption about the weights of these states, and it's sort of agnostic, and all it cares about is the order, and there's no weighting, which isn't true. You know, to create a single measure for this scale, you need some way of weighting the different levels. There has to be a weighting, really.
And that's the point to this, that you cannot avoid weighting them. So the question is, how do you do it? Now, the most common way in which stroke trials are analyzed is not the proportional odds model. It's not utility weight. It's dichotomizing the outcome. And the most common is they dichotomize it at 2. 0 through 2 is a success, and 3 and above is a failure. Now, that also imposes weights. Again, you cannot avoid imposing weights. That imposes weights on those outcomes, and I claim that this Mr. Clean investigators argued that not everybody has your utilities. I claim it imposes utilities that nobody has. Is the difference with dichotomization, which what if we do 0 through 2 as a success and 3 and above as a failure, what are the weights we're imposing upon those states?
Oh, the weights would be 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0. Did I get that? number right?
Yep. I think there's one more zero, but you're saying being in a state of 3 where you have some mobility, you have some handicap is the same as dead. You're 100% saying the weight of those are all the same. And having perfect neurological status is the same as having some disability within that, some 2 levels of disability. You're giving those equal weights, which I claim nobody has that. So you are imposing that everybody in the population has those weights, the same criticism of the utility weighted. So now, coming back to this, and I want to jump to a different trial and a different endpoint where this comes in. This has wider ramifications to the win ratio, to all kinds of endpoints. But I want to, we explore, now let's jump to a different trial, the REMAP-CAP trial. And Lindsay said, by the way, she went from analyzing spaghetti in a grocery store and she joined Berry, and it was almost right upon joining that we had this pandemic explode. And Lindsay got thrown into the REMAP-CAP trial, which was a global platform trial in treating hospitalized COVID patients within that. Now, describe the endpoint we use for COVID in that trial.
Yeah, so when the COVID pandemic started, they introduced a new endpoint to the platform specifically for the COVID group of patients. It was an ordinal endpoint, and it's kind of a composite endpoint. So the endpoint is called organ support free days, and it's a composite of in-hospital mortality. So the worst possible outcome is the patient dies in hospital, and that would be the worst possible outcome. And we label that with a -1. It's just a label. And then if a patient survives to hospital discharge, their ordinal outcome is based on the duration of organ support that they received during their hospital stay. So there were certain types of organ support that qualify for this definition. So being on a ventilator, taking vasopressors, inotropes, a couple different types of cardiovascular and respiratory organ failure support. What we look at is through day 21, how many days was the patient free of organ support? So the best possible outcome would be you're free of organ support for 21 days. So if you survived a hospital discharge and you're free of organ support for 21 days, your outcome is a 21. For survivors, the worst outcome is that you were on organ support the entire duration of 21 days. So your duration free is 0 days. And so your outcome would be labeled as a 0. So there are 23 possible levels for this outcome. The worst is death, labeled a -1. And then we have 0 up through 21, which is the best outcome.
And we model that with a proportional odds model.
Yes.
In REMAP-CAP, as you said, you sort of want to make clear to people that I do use the proportional odds model within that. And I don't hate the proportional odds model. The interesting thing is, and by the way, the results that came out of REMAP-CAP that use that endpoint and the proportional odds, now it combines death and length of organ support. It is weighting death relative to other outcomes. We just learned that. We never said what it was, but it's imposed by the prevalence in there. The results that came out of REMAP-CAP, I think overwhelmingly clinicians really like the results. When it had a bad proportional odds or a good one, they looked at the overall results and said, yes, that's clinically is good within that. Now, you went back and calculated exactly what our weighting was of those, and it actually looks reasonable, but that's prevalence dictated that. So for example, from surviving and leaving the hospital, but you're on organ support the entire time, compared to death, was a difference in utility of 0.3. Again, the max difference is 1, on this. We can normalize it to 1 was 0.3. From 0 days free of organ support, so being on organ support for 21 days in the hospital but living, a change of 0.3 above that goes to about 15 days. So 2 weeks shorter of organ support is equivalent on the right to somebody dying on the left. We didn't do that. We didn't create those clinical weights. Nobody did. The prevalence of how often they happen created the relative value of those. Now, when clinicians looked at these weights and you showed them and said, by the way, this proportional odds that we're doing, this is what it does, they looked at it and said, it's not too bad. It's pretty reasonable within that, which is why they liked the results that came out of the proportional odds model. Now, we tried to create a new endpoint. So we were trying in REMAP-CAP to include things below organ support. Level of oxygen, length of time in the ward, length of time in the hospital. And we used a daily ordinal model that was, again, a proportional odds model. We ran through the same data and showed the results out of results we already had using this daily ordinal with different ordinal values. And largely the clinicians, I say hated, they very much disagreed with the proportional odds model because all of the switches were happening in states that were much less clinically relevant than the big shifts, which only had smaller number of shifts. And it was attracted to shifts. It wanted to see shifts, and the model's trying to figure that out. And so they looked at the proportional odds weighting and said, well, no, we don't like that at all. And we had to actually scrap it because the statistical assumption was creating weights that we didn't agree with at all. Now, we've been working on ways, can we actually clinically weight these states? And it's an active activity. So I want to go back, and I never told people how we created those original weights. And when we were stuck with this problem in Dawn, we didn't just arbitrarily do it. We found 2 studies that had done research exactly on this, looking at patient-reported outcomes on quality of life as a function of their state and their preference on the states, and then an economic valuation for the economic burden of those. The amazing thing was they were almost exactly the same. The economic burden and the patient rating of those particular scales, and we used those utilities to drive the decision in the trial. And so we found, I think, clinically relevant ways to weight those 7 potential outcomes. Interestingly, the 5, the vegetative state, actually was negative. It was worse than death. We didn't allow that to happen. We made that 0 within the scale. But otherwise, these are the ways we created our utilities. Now, maybe it was a mistake, maybe it wasn't. We use the word utilities, and that gets everybody flustered. When others do proportional odds and it imposes a weight on there, people are less flustered with that. But because we called it utilities, well, I have my own utilities. You can't impose utilities on me, is the sort of reaction to this. But the point of this mathematically is, by using a statistical assumption, you're imposing it. Now, which one's more comfortable to you? And I'll just throw out a couple cases where this comes out. Everybody's familiar with a win ratio. Win ratio is an ordinal outcome. The ALS-FRS, the ALS Functional Rating Scale, doesn't include death. Everybody's trying to figure out, how do you combine death and ALS with the functional status of them? And we do non-parametric things, we do CAFs or we do joint models. All of those things impose a weight of death relative to functional things. We've gone in with a weight and we're told no, but to a joint rank, sure, you can do that sort of thing. So it's been really interesting, this handling of ordinal outcomes, trying to create utilities in this with the statistical assumptions imposing them.
Yeah, and I don't think you get away from this issue if you just do non-parametric tests. So, those also, even the sort of like rank-based test, those also have their own implied utilities. Sometimes it's just really hard to figure out what they are. They're kind of hidden behind the math.
Yeah, and if we do a win ratio where you count wins, and the first level is death, the second level is heart failure hospitalization, then it's pro-BNP or a biomarker, you're weighting those clinically. What is a change in the pro-BNP relative to a hospitalization? Now, it's done behind the non-parametric test, but you have imposed a weight. So a lot of these things, the win ratios, the proportional odds models, the DOOR is a Scott Evans, where they look at desirability of outcomes rating within this. My issue with them is maybe we should just be assigning clinical value to the relative states and get in front of the problem and not hide behind a statistical assumption assigning those clinical weights. What do you think of that? Now, we've tried to do that in REMAP-CAP.
It's hard because at its core, you're writing down what's the difference in death and not death, and that's just really uncomfortable, and it feels hard to justify. And I think it would be unfortunate if someone listened to this conversation and their reaction was just, oh my God, that's so complicated. I don't know what I'm implying. I'm just going to dichotomize, or I'm just going to use death as my endpoint and ignore the other information. I don't think that's what we would recommend. There is additional information from these ordinal endpoints. We think we should use all of it, and we think those categories should be weighted appropriately. And there's just figuring out how to do that is the hard part and the work that needs to be done.
Yeah. And I do phase 3 trials in stroke where we do proportional odds. You're going to have to beat me over the head and drag me to do a dichotomous. but we do proportional odds. We do proportional odds in REMAP-CAP. And we do win ratio tests. We do this. And so we're continually trying to figure out the right way to measure feels, functions, and survives. And these are the challenges that go into it. All right. So the battle continues, and I love being able to pose mathematical problems, and Lindsay solved them, and it brings about really interesting challenges in clinical trials.
Yeah, and maybe we should mention we are working on a paper. We have a first draft ready and a goal of submitting it this year, and hopefully much sooner than the end of the year. So hopefully more to come on that.
So everybody out there, that was Lindsay's incredibly polite way of saying the paper's in Scott's corner, and please hurry up and get it off of your corner. So yes, we are moving on that. All right. Thank you, everybody. Until next time, we will be here in the interim.